Okay, I'm very pleased to welcome Debra Marsh as today's presenter. Debra is an experienced EFL teacher and teacher trainer and has been involved in online English language learning for over 15 years. She's written extensively for the online medium and currently works for Cambridge University Press as an Associate Director of Pedagogy, Research and Training. Her current role involves advising institutions on appropriate blends for their English language learning programs. So, welcome Debra, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Good afternoon, good morning, or perhaps good evening to some of you. I can see the chat window filling up rapidly and the number of attendees going up. I'm looking forward to talking to you this afternoon about blended learning as an introduction to the concept, and I look forward to the discussion at the end. What I will be doing in this webinar is I will be introducing some key principles, pedagogical principles, which underlie blended learning, or more specifically, blended language learning. I will be exploring some of the opportunities and the challenges that blended learning presents, particularly for us as language teachers and our students learning a language. And then I will be looking at a practical case study example which provides a definition of blended learning and how you may effectively work with the concept in your own language teaching. What is blended learning? Whenever I'm working with teachers, this is the first question that either I ask in the session or they ask of me. Blended learning is all the rage, very much the word of the moment, the hype of the moment in forums, discussions, articles. But exactly when you ask somebody to define blended learning, simply put, you have blended learning in the middle of those circles with face-to-face and online. It can go more complex and add collaborative learning and self-paced learning. Even more complex with different functions such as chats, seminars, workshops. Even more complex with gaming, interactive whiteboards, and the iPad. Although if you notice from all those diagrams that I've just shown, the single constant in that is the classroom learning. In a definition of blended learning, and this is the theme that will be running through my webinar this afternoon, is that the constant in this is the classroom. And that is what I'd like you to bear in mind. But it is important to define blended learning within your context, what it means for you, and what it means for your institution as a starting point. Last year, I was asked to write a booklet called Blended Learning. I was asked to describe what my understanding of blended learning and to provide ideas and support to teachers. What I did is I had a subtitle, because for me, blended learning is all about creating learning opportunities for language learners. Let's take a step back, away from the word blended, and think about how to create learning opportunities for our language learners. So far, two key ideas to bear in mind. The classroom as the constant in our definition, and the importance of creating learning opportunities for our language learners. Let's look at this differently. We have blended language learning. If we turn that on its head, we have learning, language, blended. The third concept to take away with it. Start with the learning, next with the language, and let's think about the blended. Because language is complex. Let's go back to language. Language is complex. There's no one way to learn a language. Learning a foreign language presents different challenges for different people in different contexts. And the reasons for learning a language are as diverse as the ways different individuals approach the task of figuring out new grammar rules, reading, listening, and speaking in a language other than their native language. There's no one way to teach a language. There's no one perfect way to teach a language because there are very many different criteria that are important. Students in front of you, your timetable, the institution, the expected learning outcomes. But a key question: are there optimal conditions for effective language learning? What conditions are required in an effective learning environment? Keep these questions in mind because they're important as we think about what we mean by blended language learning. A lot of research has been done trying to find out exactly what is meant by these optimal conditions. Here's a summary of some of the key conditions that researchers have found. An optimal condition is in which the learners are able to interact in the target language with an authentic audience. Learners are involved in an authentic task. Learners are exposed to and encouraged to produce varied and creative language. Learners have opportunities to interact socially and negotiate meaning. Have enough time and feedback. Learners are guided to attend mindfully to the learning process. Work in an atmosphere with an ideal stress, anxiety level. And learner autonomy is supported. This is what the research says, but as all we all know as teachers, these optimal conditions are not easy, not all of them easy to achieve within our classroom. Let's face it, in our classrooms, we have individual learning preferences, different backgrounds, different priorities and reasons for learning a language. As language teachers, we understand that to serve the needs of our learners, we need to create an environment that closely resembles actual use of target language, and in an attempt to achieve as far as possible this optimal learning environment. We have long used all sorts of tools. You must all recognize these somewhat old-fashioned tools, as we would now say, and in the past we called these realia. Before we had digital, we called them realia. But in trying to create this blend, we realized that what we've been doing up until this point is actually blended learning. Blended learning in itself is not a new concept. Let's recap. We want to create the optimal conditions for our students. We understand that one size does not fit all. So before technology came along, we tried our very best to blend learning to achieve the effective learning environment for our students. So what is new? Why has blended learning appears to be so complex? Essentially, technology is making it possible to provide different learning opportunities and environments through its use. And there's also this expectation to use technology in and out of the classroom as part of the learning process. We have had computers in the classroom since the 1960s. But there's been an absence of technology which is appropriate to the specific needs of language learning. In my discussions with teachers, this has been a key question that teachers have asked me. That they want to blend using technology, but they're saying the technology, how can it replace what we understand to be language learning, language interaction as best effective practice? With the internet, you have a community of English language speakers. Our students have access to authentic resources, and there are communication tools such as Skype, instant message, forums, and blogs. And still, when I'm talking to teachers, the concept of blending all of these resources into their existing teaching practice has proved to be complex. But why is this so? if the concept and practice of blending language opportunities is not new, why is it complex? Because when well understood and implemented, it has the potential to support deep and meaningful learning. But, and this I'm sure all of you are agreeing and nodding in the various parts of the world, simply mixing the technology with face-to-face learning is not sufficient to exploit the potential of blended learning. What is important as a starting point is finding your blend. What's also important is to think about how this combination is not necessarily the right or the best or the most innovative as opposed to traditional, but how the blend creates a learning environment that works as a whole. Because we believe that blended learning is essentially all about making the most of the opportunities in order to achieve the optimal learning environment. Now, that sounds all very well in the theory. It sounds all very well with me passing the slides in front of you. But what does that actually mean in practice? Here I'm going to give you a practical example of blended learning, which, if I were to change the name from blended learning, is how to make the most of your classroom. Okay, something for you to think about and something for you to interact. Think about your previous 3 or 4 lesson plans. Think about how you carefully wrote them. You had planned exactly what you wanted to do with your students. You walk into the classroom, off you go, and all that careful planning, there is one part of your lesson that you did not have time to do. You ran out of time for all sorts of reasons. Think about that lesson. And in the chat box, share your thoughts. Which part of your previous lesson plan, 3 or 4 in the past, did you not have time to do with your students? A couple of seconds. Pop your answers into the chat box and share your thoughts with everybody. And they're coming in fast.
Yes, there's quite a range, isn't there, Deborah?
Yes, there is. And they're still coming, and some more. And a few more. What is interesting is that here we go. This is the bit. What is interesting is when we plan our lessons, we have to, as I explained before, think of all sorts of variables. Our students in front of us, their different learning, their understanding, and we have to present the language and get them to practice it. But as most of you, as I say, most of you saying, this is what is my experience of talking to other teachers, is that we run out of time for the students to actually use the language. And in fact, this is in itself a learning outcome for our lesson. When we plan our lesson, the whole aim of it, the ultimate aim, is for our students to use the language in the classroom. And another one said the speaking part. Why does this happen? Now I'm going to take you through a case study of what we've had experience in the research and what we are now calling more of a flipped classroom for blended language learning. I'll give you the examples. Let's take a classroom activity. You are teaching a lower level, Unit 6. This is a Unit 6 in one of our Touchstone, and these are the outcomes for the lesson. Telling the students they're going to learn to talk about the neighbourhood, there's and there are, and use quantifiers. You plan your lesson around these learning outcomes because your ultimate aim is to encourage your students to talk about their neighbourhood. That's what you want them to do. But before your students can do this, you need to pre-teach the vocabulary. You need to set the scene so the students have some context within which they're talking. You need then to preview the task, give the instructions, explain the task. And how many times have you had to explain the task? At least twice, if not 3 times. Because certain groups of students at the back have not understood, have been too busy talking, and are not following the lesson. And then you complete the task. You complete the pre-teaching tasks, you complete the practice tasks, and if you're lucky, you'll have enough time within the time allocated in that classroom to encourage the students to talk about their neighbourhood. If I asked you to compare how much time you spent in the classroom actually pre-teaching, previewing language, and that's classroom management, compared to the time allowed for the students to actually use the language, the percentage is relatively low. What we're saying here is that for blended learning, and it's just a concept, a definition of blended learning, the classroom is the starting point. What do we want to achieve in the classroom? We want the students to talk. We want the students to be able to use the language that has been presented and that has been practiced. What we have done at Cambridge University Press is we have developed a product which allows the teacher full flexibility, but also allows the teacher to maximize the time in the classroom for language use. The online version of Touchstone, is Touchstone Blended Learning, has the same learning outcomes as the print, has the same syllabus, and has the same approach to teaching and learning. This is an example of one product. But for blended learning to be truly effective, what the student does outside the classroom needs to be fully integrated into what he or she is doing inside the classroom. Blended language learning is not simply asking the students to do online activities as homework. Blended, as the word suggests, means fully integrating the activity online with the activity in the classroom, so the students can see the follow-through. Let me give you a clearer example. In the ideal world, we would like something to pre-teach the vocabulary to our students. And here is an example of an online activity which pre-teaches the vocabulary, places in the neighbourhood, that the students require to be able to talk about their own areas. In the second activity, the language is then presented. The students are online, they've had the vocabulary introduced, they're working at their own pace, and then they have the language presented. Here in this video, the scene is set for the students to be able to understand the context within which they are working. In this one, the task is previewed. And then the students complete the task.
Okay, back to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Alistair. In case you're wondering, Alistair was having to manipulate that for me. There's a slight time lag. So if I just take that one back, the students have completed that task online. And as a recap, before the students have come to the classroom, the language has been pre-taught, the scene has been set, and they previewed the task. Now this is our concept of blended language learning, that the students are all at different levels of learning, they have different needs, and this is what takes up so much time in the classroom, is managing the students so that when we arrive at the actual speaking or the interaction task, some of you at the listening or the writing, when we arrive at the task in which we want this to produce, we want the students to be at the same level so we have effective communication. If we can achieve this before class, if our students complete this before they come into the classroom, we are then able, after a quick review of the language, to use the classroom environment for what it's best to use, the most effective use. For you as the teacher to use you as the perfect tool, the language teacher who has that experience, who can facilitate the interaction. Because blended learning doesn't have to be about technology in a classroom. What it's all about, some interaction can take place online through audio recording, in which the students can record their voices without feeling a failure of talking out front in front of their peers to start with. So before class, the language is introduced, the vocabulary is introduced, and the students can practice in a safe environment. In class, they have been prepared to participate in pair and group work, and the student-to-student interaction is maximized. After class, we're using a variety of different tools such as blogs and forums and voice tools. The interaction phase is then extended. Now we're talking about before class, in class, and after class as part of our blend. We're not talking about homework. The three phases, before, in, and after, are part of the blended language learning. And here is a recap of where we are with blended language learning. I'm also involved in a number of research studies to analyze the effectiveness of this model of blended language learning. Blended in the sense that the classroom takes the focal point, that technology doesn't necessarily have to be in the classroom, but we're using the technology for what its most appropriate use at this particular time. And that's for language presentation, which is media rich, language practice, so the students have feedback, and the students are able to do the exercises as many times as they want to. The pedagogical value for language learning, of blended learning, is that we can now provide for our students in the classroom opportunities to actually use the language. Opportunities which before we as teachers just didn't have time to do, because much of our role involved presenting, pre-teaching, and helping the students practice before they could actually communicate. For me, blended language learning is all about focusing on the effective and the efficient use of classroom time. For me, blended language learning, this is my starting point, is what do I want to do in the classroom? And increasingly, a classroom is not always face-to-face. Increasingly, classrooms are also, as we are working now, virtual. But the starting point for an effective blend is that efficient and effective use of classroom time. We are then using the technology to practice and review and recycle in order to improve that learning experience. In no way is the technology replacing the teacher. It's the teacher that needs to manage this process, and it's the teacher who will facilitate the learning. And let's use the technology to do which takes up so much time in our classrooms, and takes away the potential, the opportunity to achieve the learning outcome. We're also providing the support for the differentiation in learning needs, the pace of learning, and the learning styles. In front of us, when we have a class of 20, 30, and I know for some of you even higher numbers of students in our class, within that 20, 30, we can have 30 different learning styles, pace of learning, and learning needs. If somehow we can help the students to arrive at almost a common point when they enter the classroom, without a doubt, we can make much better use of what we do in our limited classroom time to practice and improve and use the language. That is my and our, the Cambridge University Press, definition, one definition of our blended language learning. Focus on the classroom and let the technology do what it does best. Thank you very much for listening. That was a half-an-hour presentation. I suspect there are a lot of questions. Please start sending them through, and I look forward to the following active discussion with you all.
Okay, thanks very much, Deborah. We've got our first question in already. We've had a few questions from people asking if there's a British English version of Touchstone, but it's just American English. But we've also had a question from John Staley, who asks about what we can do for students who lack access to computers.
Yes, I mean that potentially, if we're using the access to the computers potentially in a blended environment, if we're using the technology, it is very limiting. Now, I know some institutions provide computers. I know they provide them within the institutions and self-access study. But I think if we are going to be realistic about this, if we want to implement blended language learning with technology, remembering that I did say that we've been blending language learning with all the ALIA for many years now, we need to provide access to everybody. And I know that is not the case. I mean, and I think we just have to ask ourselves, if we can't provide the access to technology to everybody, is our institution ready for that course of action?
Okay, thanks. I've got a few more questions coming in now. Question from Linda Price, who asks for if you could give just a very concise definition of blended learning. I wonder if you could possibly manage one that we could fit into a tweet, just 140 characters or about sort of 25 words. Okay,
well, all right, blended language learning, 25 characters, that's a chart.
25 words, not 25
words. 25 characters, I'll never make it. I would say that blended language learning is all about the face-to-face and the interaction and how the technology supports that. Now, that's not the traditional definition, but that's exactly what blended language should be all about.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question from Piotr, who says, how do you make sure that nobody falls behind? Because there are many students who don't do their homework, don't prepare adequately for lessons. We might end up having a group of bright, diligent learners and a group of dummies who haven't done the work.
I mean, that is one of the advantages of using technology, because now with the technologies that we have, we're able to track student progress, student activity, and now with the introduction, so many of you have heard about adaptive learning, which we're not anywhere near ready to implement this yet, but as people are talking, is the technology is able to adapt the learning and will be able to adapt the learning for the individual. This teacher, these days with the technology available, is able to see which students have completed activities, which students are having difficulties. So to some extent, the teacher is there to facilitate that and to make sure that those students who are coming up as having difficulties, they are able to take to one side perhaps after the class. What we're also finding, though, is that in the classroom, it becomes obvious that the students who are getting a little bit left behind, and they themselves are voluntarily going up to the teacher at the end of the class and saying they're struggling because they want to participate in that communication. But I think that's where the technology does play its role, but it doesn't take away from the fact that as teachers, we are very quick at observing which students are having difficulties.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question now from Rafe, which I think sounds as though it could well be from personal experience here. Can we achieve blended learning in an exam-based educational system which is mainly concerned with using the mother tongue excessively and focusing on memorizing and not so much on using the language?
Yeah, good question.
How can blended learning help there?
Yeah, good question. In terms of the focus of exams, then the main advantage, if you like, is that speaking, is that productive skill. Although many exams, the speaking component, the writing component, is only a proportion of that. So yes, blended learning can help in that sense. If you're wanting to do the model that I was just talking about, the technology can help for the practice side after class. In a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to be talking about different models of blended learning, and I've just made a note of myself that I will certainly talk about that exam environment. But I think what I'd like to say is that as there's not a single model of blended learning, the one I have just talked about here is one that focuses largely on the productive skills. There are other ways of looking at how the technology can support the exam practice. Exam practice being that the students can work through certain points of grammar on their own, certain points of vocabulary.
Okay, thanks. Got a question now from John Staley, who's, I think, picking up on your suggestion that there's various different models here. And John asks whether there's a model where language labs in a school can take the place of computer access outside school. So a way that blended learning can work in that model? Yes,
I mean, it's certainly within the constraints of timetabling. If you have a 1-hour class, I understand that you can also then, there's a constraint that you want them to do some work. It would mean timetabling, obviously, a computer session for the students in which they're working through the work you wish them to do. The ideal situation there would be where that would be self-study, that they weren't constrained to fixed times, but that's not always realistic. But there's no reason why the work that's required online cannot be done in a school in a language lab as opposed to the student at home on their own tablets or laptops.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question from Anna now, who asks about how we overcome the scenario where you're trying to teach in a blended way with course books that don't have these sorts of exercises to be done at home.
Yes, I mean, essentially, I think there are a lot of course books now that produce the workbooks, the online workbook type activities, which is useful for the practice. But I think, yes, I would agree there is a certain challenge if you are looking for material and content to provide the input and to provide the vocabulary practice before class. Now, there are freely available websites that practice vocabulary. There are freely available websites which provide videos and YouTube. It would take some preparation on the part of the teacher, but there is a wealth of content out there. It's just not packaged in the same way as a course as we have done with Touchstone, of course.
Okay, thanks. Now I've got a question from Carol, who asks whether blended learning assumes that students already have a good understanding of technology, and whether that could be problematic, and whether the students can become distracted by the technology and focus less on the learning. Yes,
that's a good point. I think when we started this 5 years ago, and when the digital learning so-called revolution just taking off, we were very conscious of the fact that students may not be confident with technology. That's certainly not the case now. Most students of a particular age group, and even older, I would say, are very confident and do the basics, learning with technology. The distraction and how to learn with the technology is another issue altogether. And knowing from my own children, they are perfectly capable of having multiple windows open on Facebook and every other tool under the sun, as well as their learning, and they call it multitasking. I'm not sure sometimes just how much learning is going on. I think the key to blended learning, and I keep going back to this, but the key is to ensure that the students see that whatever happens whatever they do online, there is a direct impact on their performance in the classroom. If the students think they can get away with it, if they think that the homework is not going to have an impact on the classroom, then they will certainly use every ploy they can not to do it. But if it's truly blended, if the online work is fully integrated into whatever they're doing into the classroom, the students will see a reason for doing this, particularly if there is some sort of continuous assessment, perhaps within the classroom environment, which the students are given participation marks or achievement marks of their performance, having worked online on their own. But yes, it's like with any homework though. In the good old days when I was a student, there was always discussion about us being distracted by television and doing our homework in front of television. So I think we have the same arguments now, whether we do it in front of the television or with an iPad.
Okay, thanks. I think that's an absolutely vital point, that we need to make sure that the students are aware of the way that the homework does impact on their learning and on their marks, for instance.
Yes. Yeah. If it's seen as just homework, but if it's seen as something that's more than homework, that's something that is actually part of that classroom, part of the learning process, it's that motivation that we're finding that's coming through with the students.
Okay, thanks. And we've got a question from John Stead, who's asking about tracking the student work outside of class. Would it be good to talk a little about how, for instance, Touchstone does that? Yeah,
I mean, the particular tracking is so that you can see which activities the students have done. In terms of concept, we need to remember that this is teaching and this is not testing. So the important part of what we have tried to achieve in the concept is that as the students are working through the content, the theory being they should be able to get it 100% right, and they can have as many attempts as they like. The teacher can see how many attempts the students have made at a particular activity. So on the face of it, all students may get 100%, but there may be certain students who've taken 10 attempts, another student who's taken 1. And that's an important part of the tracking, if you like, is not the score, but to see how many times the students have to attempt something before they're able to get it accurate. In that, you're able to see the active number of attempts. There is a model of score, but as I said, the aim is it's teaching concept. You're not testing their understanding. So they're taken through step by step, so they, at the end of it, that they have a full understanding before they go into the classroom to use the language.
Okay, thanks. Got a question now from Elizabeth, who's asking about courses like Cambridge Ventures, where there's an online workbook, and whether you've got any suggestions about how one might teach, might use blended learning or a blended learning approach.
With the workbooks, which is a follow-up to the classroom, you obviously haven't got the before class with the pre-teaching or vocabulary and input, but I think if you wanted to make it fully blended, is to see that the workbook activity is a follow-up to the after-class work as a practice. But if somehow in the following class you can develop a speaking activity which will show their understanding of that workbook activity, then you're moving a further step forward to blended learning within the concepts that I've been talking about this afternoon, rather than just providing homework. In some of the workbooks we're now producing, we're also looking at putting in the speaking type activities so that the workbook an online workbook is not just a follow-up online practice after language is being presented in class, but it's also a preparation for a classroom speaking activity to follow. Now, if you're using some of the workbooks which don't have that, then perhaps as teachers, we're all very creative and are able to develop these activities. But that would show the teacher that there's this follow-through. And what they're doing online, there's a follow-through through the different lessons.
Okay, thanks. Got a question from Marcella, who asks, how would you allocate the amount of time, so dividing it between classroom work and online work for a typical lesson?
As a starting point, when I'm working with institutions, when they're developing their curriculum, I normally suggest 50-50. So 50% of the time in the classroom to 50% online. That's a realistic starting point. as in the first instance, students tend to think that what we're doing is just giving them more homework.
Yeah.
So if they do 50% online and 50% in the classroom, they don't feel they have to do everything. You know, the teacher's having a get-out clause and not doing any work in the classroom. Realistically, given how much time you may have in the classroom, the more you focus in the classroom on the productive skills, inevitably the more the students expect to do online. But I certainly, in the planning of blended learning, I wouldn't go any further extremes than 50-50. And it would depend how many hours you had available for the students, and how many in the classroom, and how many study hours that they have. But a fair ratio is half and half.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question now from Eddie, who asks about correcting oral errors from students, and what's maybe the best way to deal with this when you're doing a blended course that perhaps has a very high proportion of online.
Yeah, this is a frequent question about oral errors, and my tendency, given the way technology works at the moment, is to say that that is probably best placed in the classroom, doing error correction as we would do in actually fluency activities. We do have tools, when we have tools, particularly within Touchstone, which allow the student to make recordings, and then the teacher is able to listen to these recordings to provide the feedback. But as soon as you do this as a teacher and you start providing feedback one-to-one to that student, and I could probably always see, I can't see you, but you're probably all raising your eyes thinking this is increasing my workload 100-fold. It's also not necessarily that beneficial to the student, because the immediate feedback that a student receives in a classroom, perhaps after a speaking task, is probably more beneficial than something currently that's delivered electronically. I'm not saying that the technology will not be obsolete at the time, but at this particular point in time, I usually recommend that error correction take place in the classroom for immediate feedback.
Okay, thanks. Got a follow-up question from Anna, thinking about just about how do you affect students' assumptions that a workbook equals homework, and and how do we actually change those perceptions?
Yes, it's interesting because the word homework, and I won't try it with this forum, but if you say to a group of teachers, I'm going to say one word to you, and I want to have your immediate reaction to it, and you say homework, then any adjective to describe that is negative. Because we all have these ideas that homework should be a bit of a drudge. Once again, I think what we need, and I think that comes down to us as publishers as well, is to ensure that any work that the student is required to do online is integral to their learning face-to-face in the classroom overall, and not seen as an add-on. And I think this has been part of the problem of technology and the use of technology in the past. It's been seen as supplementary, and it's been seen as an add-on rather than integral to the face-to-face learning experience. I may be wrong, and I may be proved wrong in 10 years' time, but I still feel that the face-to-face experience of learning is vital for language learning, and it's that part that the students need to see that it is vital, and that whatever they're doing online is integral. You know, just simply practicing and doing repetitive exercises is what is this negative homework. We have work to do as publishers to ensure that what we are producing online achieves that, what I would call blend. There is that for the teacher to cross over from the classroom online effectively.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for a few more questions if we have any. So we've got a suggestion from John, who says that maybe we should move away from homework and suggest, we're getting some suggestions now, but use the expression extended classwork, or even from
Excellent.
Sandra, juicy exercises.
Excellent, keep them coming. I've been trying to find a new word for homework for years.
So consolidation task from Pedro.
Yeah. If we're working on the idea that we want, the classroom goes beyond the four walls, the learning goes beyond the four walls. Consolidation, yes, very nice.
Okay, reflection. We've had, I think, one suggestion of reflection. Somebody who's less keen on it. Okay, I think if we have no more questions, we'll allow another minute or so just to see if any questions come in. But other than that, we'll wrap up slightly early. So we need to just let you know that we've got a few more webinars coming up. So in 2 weeks' time, on September the 30th, Deirdre Kiffers will be talking about using forums and blogs with higher level learners. And you can sign up for that on our news and events page, which I'll post into the chat box, or Simon, my colleague, will post into the chat box now. And we've also got a whole series of webinars coming up, generally at 3 o'clock UK time on Mondays, mostly every 2 weeks. And we've got presenters include Michael McCarthy, Herbert Puchter, Miranda Hamilton, and yes, so a good set of webinars coming up. We've also got, if you're a member of Cambridge English Teacher, then there are webinars every fortnight there, and the next Cambridge English Teacher webinar is by Shaka Manassian, talking about assessment in the classroom. So Simon has shared the link for, actually, so the link Simon has shared is not actually their own. Simon shared the link for the paper that Debra's shared. I'll put the link up for the actual more webinars in a moment. Now we'll be making this webinar available as a recording. That should be available from Monday. And if you email my colleague Simon, who'll be posting his email address, then we'll send you a certificate as well. So we'll stop the webinar now, and I'll post the link in the chat box. Thanks very much, Deborah, for a very interesting session. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time, I hope. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.